I go through this series of doctors in Los Angeles. I went to 18 doctors, and I was viewing it from this perspective of like I had something so severe that would basically was mercury-induced dementia, and they tried to give me pills and put me on thyroid meds, and there were some tangible things they could see that were wrong with me, but nothing to equate to what was actually happening to me.
Welcome to the Invisible Encourage Show, a production of the Invisible Disabilities Association. Join us as we explore the stories and topics shaping the lives of those with invisible disabilities and all who support them. Let's get started.
Hello everybody, Jess Stainbrook here with the Invisible Disabilities Association on another episode of our Invisible Encourage podcast. And we always have these amazing discussions, and today I've got Michelle O'Connell Katz with me, who wrote an incredible book, Awakening in an Age of Metals, and I'm actually curious to hear the whole story. I think it'll be a lot of fun. Michelle, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jess. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you today.
Well, I think it's going to be my honor to hear the story. I mean, you have been on quite the journey to get this book completed, and I would imagine that the book wasn't the goal, the healing was the goal, right?
Correct. Sometimes like we lose sight of that, in the wake of publishing the book and getting it out in the last couple of weeks. There have been a lot of podcasts and interviews and things like that. And congratulations, which is nice. It's so beautiful when people kind of gather around and say like, this is so amazing. Wow, you published a book, you have a podcast. But I always am quick to at least remind myself that the anchor of everything that I've been able to accomplish really revolved around simply wanting to become whole in my body again.
Well, and I think you even say in your little intro of on my 12-year journey, and people don't realize that, right? They read a book, oh, this is so amazing, and well, this is so, but you go through these things that lead you to a point of an end point to share that information. So I'm going to say, take me on the journey. Tell me the story.
Well, first I have to caution you in the audience to buckle up because it is quite the upside down roller coaster ride. And quite frankly, and I tell people this a lot, even though I'm distant from it, there was a time in the first, I'd say 3 years that I really wasn't sure that I was going to make it to the point where I could actually tell the story. So I'm going to take everybody back to the end of 2013. And I was a network executive. I had had a long career as a film and television producer on very high profile, complex film and television shows. I had been a line producer for a long time. And then I was at a small television network in Santa Monica, and I was the VP of production. And so I was really developing and producing all of the internal content, all of the production work, all of the shows for the network. And on the side, I was a singer-songwriter because that's what I had been doing for most of my life. And, LA was like the perfect place to have lots of different sort of creative careers.
creative outlets, if you will, right?
Yeah, like different personas. And, by day I would be producing art content, and at night, like I would be at the House of Blues singing. So
That's really awesome. How did I not know this part? This is crazy. I mean, I don't know if you know my background. I mean, I'm in media and film and all that stuff. So this is really the fun part too. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I was loving seeing the overlap in our backgrounds in our careers. And so so I was living in LA, kind of living life, feeling pretty carefree and pretty good, although busy and stressed. And it took me 3 years. And the reason why the book is sort of a thriller, I mean, people text me and are like, what is going on? What's happening? Like, I can't sleep at night because I don't know where the story is going exactly. And that's because I wrote it in exactly that manner because I didn't know what was happening. I just woke up one day in early January, and I felt like a Mack truck had driven over me from head to toe, but on the inside. And I began getting these horrible chronic migraines. I became incredibly depressed. I had severe panic attacks, agoraphobia, crippling anxiety, exhaustion. My hair started to fall out. My skin became quite gray. I really couldn't walk for more than like a couple of feet without having to take a break. And ultimately, I also could only eat 3 foods. I was tested at a certain point during those first 3 years. And I go through this series of doctors in Los Angeles. I went to 18 doctors, and I was viewing it from this perspective of like, I had something so severe that was mercury-induced dementia. It was severe mercury poisoning, but I wouldn't find that out until 3 years after the onset of symptoms, when by just a miracle, I would say, I found this podcast and I found this doctor in Austin, and I heard her say, I treat mysterious illnesses. And I'm like, well, this is clearly mysterious because there's not a single doctor in LA that has any earthly idea what I'm talking about. And they tried to give me pills and put me on thyroid meds. And there were some tangible things they could see that were wrong with me, but nothing to equate to what was actually happening to me, which was otherworldly. And
it sounds very indicative. I mean, Lyme disease is one of those things, right? Where it mimics these other things and nobody can figure out what it is. Celiac is very similar as well, right? So yeah, please keep going.
And along the way, I was diagnosed with all of those things. So I found this doctor in Austin, and I didn't really know what functional medicine was. This was 2016. So, there wasn't a lot of research at that time that I was, familiar with about alternative medicine, holistic medicine, functional medicine. It just wasn't the world that I was really in yet. And I found her, went to her office, had a completely different experience, and I write about it in the book. Like, they actually looked me in the eye. I wasn't totally like dismissed, like I was some kind of, strange person off the street. I talk a lot about identity and about how I went from this person who I thought had some kind of identity that maybe mattered in the world, foolishly, I guess. My ego had been in charge, and going to this other identity where I was like, completely looked at like I had rolled in, off the street and didn't have a right to be telling my story or asking for help. And she really treated me like a human, and I appreciated that. And a couple weeks later, she got all the test results back, and she said, Michelle, in all my practice, in all my years, 20 years, I've never seen mercury levels this high in a human being. Like, what did you do? And I was like, I have no idea. And she said, do you have fillings? And I said, I do, but I've had them for 35 years. Like, I can't imagine this is the cause. So that's when the detective work began. And I first made my appointment to do all of the biological dentistry. And within about 24 hours of having my first 3 fillings out, my brain opened up. And I was able to make that connection again that I once had with like nature and music and the sun. All of that was cut off. My brain was inflamed to the point where I couldn't connect to myself or the world around me. But within 24 hours of getting those fillings out, my brain started to heal. And then I went into this mad detective mode frenzy of trying to find out how this could have happened to me. And what I traced it back to was a tetanus shot that I got while I was working at this television network. I had stepped on a nail one morning, and my colleague said, oh my God, you need a tetanus shot. And I went in and I got one, and I traced it back to the colds that I started to get within a couple of days of that tetanus shot. So that's really the beginning. That was really the end of the mystery and the beginning of my spiritual awakening, because after months and months of trying to completely get better, I chelated and I detoxed, and I was in saunas, and so much of it helped. But there was a nagging underneath. There was a deep wound that couldn't clear. And during this time, my father passed away. I was very close to his bedside when he passed. And for several years after that, I still had this crushing fatigue. And one day I decided I'm going to pack up my house in LA and I'm just going to go. I'm just going to leave and I'm going to follow this wherever it takes me, to a mountaintop, to a cave, to the ocean, to a hut, to a village. I just don't care. I am going wherever this story wants me to go for the answers. And I found myself in the Amazon jungle a little while later. And during one of my ceremonies in ayahuasca, my father, who had been deceased, came into my body and he showed me his trauma as a child during the Holocaust. He showed me in my body, I started coughing. He died of COPD. I started choking and I started coughing and I started seeing and hearing and smelling all of the imagery and the memories that he had suppressed during his lifetime. And I was never the same. And I followed that. I went to ceremony after ceremony and shamanic indigenous practice after shamanic practice and mentorships and an incredible amount of years and work went into finding out what ancestral trauma is and how it related to my physical body and my well-being. And so that was also the spiritual, mind-bending, kind of hair-raising journey that I went on during the entire book.
Hmm. That's incredible. I mean, obviously that's the short version where
That is.
we can go into so many, and I hope we will. Um, just out of curiosity, how during this journey, how did your relationships change?
That is an amazing question.
Well, and
Um,
I ask it, obviously we're about people living with invisible disabilities that it's not an overtly noticeable thing, but something's going on, and there's so many different reactions as people interact, and whether that's our coworkers or whatever. And so yeah, that's why I asked the question.
I talk about that a lot in the book because I was somebody before this happened that was very much like social and an extrovert, and I was kind of always in the know, and I was always going to like cool places and cool parties. And I realized when this happened to me and I saw the reaction or non reaction in many ways from other people, friends, colleagues, doctors, where I I quite frankly couldn't adapt to the fact that they were looking right through what I considered my death. Like I was living a death filled body and a sort of a death filled journey at that point. I was just a walking corpse. And I couldn't fathom that other people wouldn't see me and like sort of drag me immediately to the ER. But it was just the opposite. They looked right through me. And I think that I carried a lot. And that's part of the reason I wrote that book, because I wanted to expel so much of the hurt and the anger and the disappointment and the shock and the horror that people like me walk around with this stuff for so long, and it it's kind of like it's not there. And so when I went into that ceremony and those things happened to me, I also worked with family members in the ceremony. The medicine was able to show me inside the psyche of all of my family members. And so I was able to see them instead of from my point of view, but from their lived experience. And so that really did give me a sense of like relief and empathy that everybody is walking around with their own invisible disability in a way, but some are more physical than others. So, in that way, I would say those journeys really changed me for the better. And also, my father was deceased at that point. I'd really never gotten a chance to get to know him on that level. He was a heavy drinker. He was very harsh verbally, and that created a lot of trauma for us, and a lot of pain. But nobody could have known the pain that he was carrying around.
Hmm. This brings up so many I mean, comments and questions on my side of like, the illness potentially carrying deeper meaning, right? And I guess my question is really the your understanding of consciousness. How did that evolve through the experience, as well as how do you balance the spiritual interpretation with reality, the medical reality?
Again, such an important question, and it really is the heart and soul of the work that I do now.
Mm,
Um, that is my message in all of my podcasts, and also in a healing program I created called Story is Medicine. So I'll go back to really the first answer and the first layer of your question, and I'll answer it by giving you a little synopsis of one of the chapters, which is my experience with 5-MeO-DMT. 5-MeO-DMT is toad medicine. So it's a toad from the Sonoran Desert, and the powder from that toad, from a gland in the toad, is scraped off, and in shamanic traditions, that powder that's taken from the Sonoran toad is smoked. And that particular ceremony was during this time when my father's consciousness was very much in me and with me, but I still didn't really understand it. I had already had my ayahuasca ceremony, so I knew he was there somewhere. But I didn't know that in every ceremony he would be coming out. So when I did 5-MeO-DMT, he came again into my body, and I felt viscerally his pain. But then I felt his mother's pain, which was even deeper than his pain. And then I felt her mother's pain. And then I felt her mother's pain. So I was going through the physical suffering and the emotional and spiritual suffering of many, many generations in my lineage, all to show me that we are not alone. We do not carry these things as isolated physical vessels, but we carry an accumulation of our family and often the collective's sickness and diseases and trauma and sadness. And that was exponentially more powerful than any, therapy session or doctor's visit like I ever could have been on. It answered thousands of years of questions about maybe why my body had been a vessel that just overflowed. Now, to take it back, there was a catalyst, and my body became too toxic to hold anything. And that catalyst, was the vaccine, but not only that, like the food and the water, and the plastics and the fluorescent lights and the LEDs and the, all of it becoming far too much for one body to handle. Granted, I didn't know what was underneath the hood, but still I had to negotiate like what is going on in my physical body and what kind of initiation process am I getting myself into, or have I been chosen for? It's often hard to know which it is. Do we choose it, or are we chosen? And that's something that is another sort of big question about consciousness. But it did open my mind, the portal that I am, to the infinite, to the infinite medicine that is available to us should we choose to see diseases as some kind of deeper spiritual initiation.
mm. Yeah, that's incredible. Um, Gosh, you talk about metals in the title even, and which was an indicator, I think, of environmental toxicity, right? Of all these things kind of coming together. Um, and the modern, I guess that's how does our modern environment affect our human health? Um, and why are people so chronically unwell as a result? I guess the my question really is probably based on your discoveries and experience. What is it that shocked you the most?
Oh my God, there were so many things that shocked me. It was like a consistent shock a series of shocks, one bigger and more abrasive than the next. But I think that my spiritual awakening really began the day that I got those test results back. I mean, that was such a shock because it put in perspective all of the 18 doctors that I had visited, all of the crazy things that I had been told, all of the ways that my pain was minimized. And in fact, in the book, I tell the story of, I woke up one day, this is before I found out I had mercury poisoning and I was so toxic, with like a really horrible, this was in early 2016, a really horrible, like lung infection. And, at that point, my body was so toxic that any little thing could throw me off and get me really sick. I couldn't take supplements and I couldn't take medication, and most foods I couldn't digest. So, but I was scared. Like I was afraid. And so I went to Cedars-Sinai, and I went to my doctor, and he gave me Tamiflu. And within a few hours, my fever shot up to 104. I ended up in the ER, and I really thought I was going to die. And finally, when they were able to see me, I had a diabolical headache that I thought there's no way that anybody could live through the kind of headache I have. They checked me, and I had this really incredibly horrible liver injury. My enzymes were through the roof, and they wanted to know if I had fatty liver disease or was an alcoholic. And it all happened because of the buildup of toxicity and the high level of mercury in my blood. And when the reports came back to my doctor, he called me in. He ran some tests, and he called me in, and he said, "How long have you been an intravenous drug user?" And I was like, I'm not an intravenous drug user. He goes, "You must be, because you have Hep C." And I was like, I have Hep C? I most certainly do not. How do you get Hep C? And he explained me all the ways, and I was like, oh, well, then you need to retest me. And this is all in the book. And the way I describe it, because I'm a very irreverent writer, and because there's so much dark Hollywood Staten Island humor in it, it's like a real ride. And I was like, in my head, I was like, wait a minute. Like, I went to the best colleges. I have a master's degree. I worked on $18 million shows. I've run television networks. Like, I am not what you think I am. I am not the image that you have planted in your mind because you have a lack of training in what the body can and cannot do. And that was a turning point for me, because suddenly my inner voice became my dominant voice. And I said, no, this is the end. And that's really when my life started to change, and I did find that woman. I took the healing into my own hands, and I said, nobody's going to define me, because he has such an incredibly small belief system that revolves around pain and suffering does not mean I have to adopt that.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. Obviously you explored indigenous and holistic healing traditions. My question on that is, how did you, what ideas were credible versus potentially misleading? And then what do you say to skeptics about alternative healing approaches?
Well, I mean, the first thing I say about alternative healing is, like, much of this is not alternative. It's just been suppressed because there isn't a lot of revenue in it. You can't patent a plant. And so most of these healing modalities come from the earth. And they have been around for thousands and thousands of years. And so things like Chinese medicine, there's so much value in Chinese medicine, because once we understand how the organs relate to our diseases and our belief systems, things start to unwind. Like, for instance, my father had COPD, and that's what he died of. And that's the lungs. And when I was in ceremony, I was coughing up all of this stuff, but there wasn't physical stuff coming out of me. I was coughing up his grief. And in Chinese medicine, the lungs hold grief. So when you have a lung disease, it's really a grief disease. And that I found to be bewildering, because I never actually was explained that. And the liver, I always had congestion in my liver during this illness, always doing coffee enemas, detoxification, which, by the way, detoxification may be considered alternative by mainstream medicine, but it's imperative. Like, unless we remove these things from our mind, body, and spirit, then there's no space to occupy new healing, new love, new frequencies, new ideas. And sound healing, well, that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, we've known since Tesla and Rife that frequencies that match disease can heal them, can kill them, kill those bacteria. And I did use the Rife machine for many years because I had been diagnosed with chronic Lyme. So I slept with a Rife machine, and I did ionic foot baths with the Rife machine. So I guess to answer your question, the indigenous practices helped me understand the ancestral piece, and the spiritual piece. Chinese medicine helped me understand the mind-body connection. And then things like sound frequency grounding, and quite frankly, what I did, which was the most powerful thing I've ever done, is I did a 61-day juice fast. And I detoxed 15 pounds of mucoid plaque out of my colon. And that changed my life forever.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, we've been on some similar things with our family where, we've actually gone through, changing our lifestyle and what we eat and how all that this stuff happens, and then seeing how that the healing process takes place. And then my wife actually wrote a cookbook off of it with some explanation of through it. And so there's, I guess, were there chapters that were really difficult to write emotionally, and what what do you hope your readers walk away with when they finish the book?
Wow, another great question. Well, all of the chapters until I got to the hope part, until I got to the part where I went to the jungle, because from the moment I went to the jungle, my life changed. I was basically in a dark broom closet for 4 years, not with suicidal ideations 24/7, which is very common with any kind of heavy metal poisoning. So I just kind of white knuckled it somehow through those 4 years. And so it was a challenge to write those chapters and continue with the thread, giving people the hope, a little bit of the thread that this does have a happy ending. And it has a very happy ending because I then go to the jungle and I learn how to open my heart because I had a lot of pain and I had a lot of grief. And so once I opened my heart, I also found love. And it all happened very mysteriously. I was sent to Boston on location for an 8 episode documentary series that I was doing. I was finally well enough to go back to work. My brain was healed enough to do that. And then I met my wife in Boston, and I got married, moved back to Los Angeles, got married. Then COVID happened and we moved up to the mountains, and we live, in a little ranch, and I wrote this book. So it became easier once the happiness piece and the light, but those years were a struggle as well. So I tried to be, I didn't want to Pollyanna this. I wanted it to be the true and real story. And to this day, my nervous system is a work in progress. And so I do a lot of work on my nervous system every single day in order to continue recovering it. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, what would you say to people who feel unheard in their own health journey?
Well, the first thing I would say is that nothing has made me happier than waking up to texts and emails every single day from people who've said they were laughing and crying and laughing and crying the entire way through the book because for the first time in a long time, they felt seen and they felt heard. And, through this, basically, the one piece that's really important is that I started to write this book because I didn't think I was going to make it, and I didn't want anybody else telling my story because I saw what people thought of my story, and that was unacceptable to me. My story was my own, and I didn't want anybody else's interpretation, or lens on it. But the writing of the story enabled me to change the wiring of my brain, which ultimately enabled me to move into a state of healing. And so that dovetailed into a lot of the work that I did based on like Annie Hopper's work and Joseph Dispenza and the indigenous practices I did, especially with the medicine iboga, which is a very, very powerful African root, and that is used to heal the brain. And it heals opiate addiction, Parkinson's, MS. It's used to basically heal very serious neurodegenerative diseases. I used that medicine and I combined all of these techniques and I created a program called Story is Medicine, where if you're in a chronic illness loop, a chronic depression, a chronic anything, you can use this technique, which is basically like brain hacks, neuroplasticity, and write your story so that you can rewrite the future and reframe the past.
That's awesome. Well, so what does awakening look like in everyday life, not just the dramatic moments?
Well, I will not sugarcoat it. My days, so I live in a high altitude, which is a little bit of pressure on the body because I have less oxygen than I'm working with up here. So I feel differently up here than I do at sea level. So when I'm here up in Idlewild, I get up and I do breath work. I probably do a series of 15 to 30 minutes of rounds of breath work to oxygenate my brain. Then I do 10 to 30 minutes based on my schedule of meditation, prayer, and visualization. Then I go to the gym and I do like high intensity cardio. Then I juice. And every other day I'll still do coffee enemas. And then I start my work and I'll write. And often I'll paint depending on the weather. That's a really good practice for nervous system healing. And I'll play with my cat and I'll hang out with my wife. And then I'll do a podcast. And then I might do a cold plunge. And then we have dinner and usually kind of curl up and read or watch a movie. And that's really like basically my life.
Yeah, that's awesome. I usually close the show with asking, in the really tough times, how do you deal with stuff? Well, it sounds like you just gave me all of those things, and that's amazing. Obviously, you're doing a podcast, you've got the book. How do people find your stuff?
Right. So my website's michelleokatz.com. And you can get in touch with me there. You can email me at michellekatz2010@gmail.com. I encourage anybody who's got questions about Story is Medicine, about healing through writing, soul. I have a program called Soul Retrieval through writing. So a lot of the shamanic work I do through that program. And Broken and Healed, this is where I interview people about transformational healing stories, things that really like bust a lot of myths in conventional medicine. We do stories on consciousness, NDEs, holistic medicine, truth about healing, all kinds of stuff like that. So that's Broken and Healed, and you can get that on Spotify and on Apple. And be sure to grab your copy of Awakening in an Age of Metals. And I'd love to hear what you think and what you thought, and if you cried, and if it helped you.
That's awesome. Any other final thoughts, things I haven't asked you that you want to share?
I just want to say that this was one of the toughest things. I'm going to try not to cry. This was the most unexpected story that I ever could have imagined for myself. And as hard and gruesome and grueling as it was, I'm glad I stuck it out.
Well, I am too. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
We've been
Jess.
talking. Yeah, thank you, Michelle, for joining us. This is such an incredible conversation. And I've been talking with Michelle O'Connor Katz, and obviously about her new book, The Awakening in the Age of Metals, and some great information, great insight into, some holistic treatment for anything that's going on. And we've got a lot of that in the invisible disability community. So thanks for joining me for this show, and we'll see you next time.